I don't like puzzles. I am one.
Hey everybody, my name is Jex Knight, and I'm going to give you 5 seconds to try and figure out what is wrong with this picture. Oh, that's right, it exists. Utopia was a show that ran for 2 seasons on Channel 4 in, you guessed it, the UK, and was about a group of young adults who meet online and get a hold of a cult underground graphic novel, which not only pins them as a target of a shadowy deep state organization, but also burdens them with the dangerous task of saving the world. And I'm only reading the online synopsis for this because Utopia is such a dense show that while it can be summarized in 1 or 2 short sentences, there is a lot more going on here than its base premise would have you to believe. Utopia ran for a wonderfully tight 2 seasons before unfortunately getting cancelled in 2014 and thus being cemented as a revered classic amongst many of the great British television dramas of all time. So why not remake it? A short time after it was cancelled, director David Fincher expressed interest in creating a remake alongside writer Gillian Flynn. This was after the two had worked together on adapting Flynn's book Gone Girl to the big screen. And though I've never seen Gone Girl, I heard it was great, I'll probably check it out someday, this combination actually seemed like a pretty good fit for something like this. As I'll get into later, I think remaking Utopia is almost a sin with how strikingly unique and smashing the original was. But I feel like David Fincher could have adapted the show in such a way where it would have been able to stand on its own. And Fincher is no stranger to adapting television. He executive produced and directed some episodes of the US adaptation of House of Cards, and alongside working on Utopia, directed many episodes of the Netflix series Mindhunter. So in thinking about how a US Utopia adaptation would go down with Fincher as the director, I imagine something visually akin to House of Cards in terms of its cloudy and gloomy lighting and color grading, and perhaps with Gillian Flynn writing something appropriate with that style as well. It obviously wouldn't be the Utopia we all know and love, but I feel like Fincher would be able to mold it into something that could be admired on its own for what a unique spin it would take on the idea. Too bad that didn't work out. Yep, after constant disputes with HBO, the project was opted to not be funded over a measly $9 million. Reportedly, the project overall would have been about $90 million to produce, so HBO was really crossing their fingers that they could get it down to $80 million. Admittedly, that budget is a bit extreme, but Fincher had really ambitious plans for what he wanted to do with the show, wanting to have it air in the summer to compete with tentpole films in terms of twists and turns and wanting to shoot it in chronological order, which if you don't know a whole lot about the ins and outs of filmmaking, is a bit of a pricey ask. But alas, the project was shelved. Fincher went on to work on Mindhunter, and the idea for his Utopia remake would be lost to time. That was until the time Amazon Studios jumped in and snatched up that IP. Ooh, yum, 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 yum. That's right, on April 19th, 2018, Amazon ordered 9 episodes direct-to-series, this time with Gillian Flynn at the helm, as David Fincher was unavailable. Who knows why. That 9 episodes eventually being cut down to a solid 8, and finally seeing the light of day as the series aired on Amazon Prime Video on September 25th, 2020. And it wasn't good. Now, before I take up too much of your generously donated time, I think it might be worth it to go over the original Utopia series and go over what makes it such an incredible series that is definitely deserving of your time. Utopia has 3 main elements that I feel make it adoringly distinct and memorable. That's the writing, the directing, and of course, the musical score. In fact, let's go over that first. Now, in the past, I've praised Cristobal Tapia de Veer's work in other shows, but we just can't deny how fantastic this score is. It's... Cristobal incorporates many interesting uses of sampling in his work to elevate the timbre and vitality of the score to pair well with the show. He'll use a one-note hum and just pitch bend the heck out of it, going further in using bits and pieces of just unrelated audio bites to create this scrupulously orchestrated field of disjointed sounds. The guy's so frickin' baller, he'll use a frickin' human femur as a percussion instrument. Not only is he impeccable at producing these melancholic and somber pieces of music with harrowing choirs and haunting music boxes, but the guy also makes heckin' bangers. I'm gonna risk getting copyright strike just so I can show you a beautiful charcuterie of what this wonderful man has to offer. And above all else, Cristobal has such a unique quality to his scores that make it some of the most original music you'll hear in any production, let alone a television production. But now onto the other stuff. Among many of the great directors who work on this show, Mark Munden brings such a special brand of cinematography to it, with not only just incredible shots sprinkled throughout the show, but even more so fantastic scenes. I don't want to get into spoilers too much in this video because I do want you to check out this show if you have the chance. But this is definitely my favorite shot of the entire series, and it's really cool even without knowing the context behind it. This is also where the writing comes in because it pairs so well with the directing to craft the best possible versions of each scene crafted for the show. And again, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but there is this scene in season 1, and if you've seen Utopia, you know exactly what I'm talking about, that despite its controversial subject matter, is probably one of the best scenes in the show, and it's just impossible for me not to gush over. Maybe we'll get into it later. Maybe we'll get into it later. I don't know. It's these moments at the end of the day that I end up loving so much, because if you're not a film critic or someone who cares an inordinate deal about the behind the scenes, it's those moments that are going to stick out to you after watching something. When someone mentions the name Utopia, you're not going to go, oh yes, well the writing in episode 3 was actually quite sublime, especially with its subtlety in its visual appearances. Like, no, you're not going to go like that. You're going to remember one of the shooting scenes, or an intro, or a specific shot that sticks out in memory. And there's something so magical about that, where it can only be achieved by a great script paired with a great director, and in this case a great composer, all working together to make sure everything works.
And that's not what happened with the new one.
And before I get into that, I do want to quickly shout out Rec Duggs, who actually made a video on Utopia that eventually sold me into watching the show, and I'm so glad that he did. He also made a great video scolding the US remake that we're going to be talking about today, and while I will be echoing some of his points, I do recommend you check out that video because he just did a great job at sort of humorously picking apart the flaws of the show, and honestly, he just did a great job at talking about it. And I feel kind of silly for not at least shouting him out a little bit, since he's the guy who sold me on watching the show. And it's pretty good. Have you seen Utopia? It's actually a really good show. And now, the moment that you have all been waiting for. Utopia is kind of a frickin' mess. Now, I have a confession to make. When I sat down to watch this new Utopia, I was expecting to hate it. I was expecting it to be a very not good. But I made a vow to myself that I would watch it with as healthy a critical eye as possible, judging it on its own merits and not just as a remake. And that's a really big ask, honestly. And this may come as a bit of a shock to you, but I thought it was fine. Now, don't get me wrong. I still didn't like it, and it's a pretty poor excuse for a Utopia remake, but looking at it as just another show on Amazon Prime, it's really not that bad. A good example of this would be a very important scene in the last episode of the show. It's a scene where they're destroying the vaccine that has caused them a lot of pain and sorrow and loss and misfortune, and it ends up being treated with the same awkwardly placed humor that has been sprinkled throughout the rest of the series. And when I first saw people talking about this scene, I was agreeably depressed. It's disgraceful when comparing it to the original, but when you consider how the US remake handled itself in presenting its tone, it really doesn't seem that far out of place from how the rest of the show is. It's depressing comparatively, but subpar relatively. Also, this show is very funny. I mean, it's not funny, but it's very funny, which ends up blurring the line between how funny it wants to be and how serious it wants to be taken. Now, in a way, I feel like having so many comedic moments could actually be a good thing, because when the dramatic moments come in, they can juxtapose the funnier ones, and overall just become stronger for it. However, that mostly works for comedies. And Utopia isn't a comedy, and since the serious scenes are never captivating or impactful enough anyway, they end up losing their power to the more lighthearted comedic tone that the show chooses to streamline. These comedic relief moments never really go away, and in fact, when certain tense and dramatic scenes occur, there is almost always a joke or an offhanded remark that ruins any sort of tension that the show desperately needs in order for those scenes to work. It truly feels weird when someone gets shot or an intense plot-driven meeting happens, and there are just these simple, inoffensive jokes that border those moments. And the show just sort of runs with that muddled tone for the rest of the episodes. The entire show seems to think it can border this line between dramatic thriller and balance it with frequent comedic relief. Meanwhile, one only ever detracts the other, and the show never feels like it has any distinct tone it can hold on to. All of this together just makes every episode feel like an incongruous mismatch of tone that never really works in the way it wants to or thinks it can get away with. Also, the story can be quite butchered and ham-fisted, like with how they dealt with Becky's Deals syndrome. In the original, gosh, I really need to find another way of saying that. It's gonna get old really fast. Becky had a disease called Deals, where she would fall into these intense seizures where she couldn't breathe. And even though we rarely saw one of her attacks, it was something that we knew the severity of based on how feverishly she would try and get a hold of medication for it. And the cool thing was, this had a point! Not only did this disease bear relevance to the plot, but it also allowed for character growth and overall had an impactful element to the show's progression. It allows Becky to become more involved with unraveling the conspiracy, as well as causing her to make certain decisions that might have conflicted with the rest of the group. In the new one, she has a few attacks, gets a funnel shoved down her throat, and I think that's it? I genuinely do not know how Becky having Deals affected this plot at all, other than to distract from it to remind us that, yep, she's still got that Deals syndrome. That's pretty serious. And it's annoying to me because it's just another one of those things that they felt compelled to add to this remake, but gave it none of the ramifications which made it such an influential part of the story to begin with. And also, on the subject of that throat-cutting scene, whoo boy, what a treat. So Becky is having one of her Deals attacks, and this time, perhaps because she's distraught at the moment or something, Jessica Hyde decides to help in the only way she knows how, by cutting a large gap in her throat and just jamming a funnel down in there. And then nothing happens, except that she's bleeding profusely from her throat, and Jessica Hyde's just like, well, that didn't work, and then she just leaves. Another interesting action to note is that Jessica Hyde just shoots and kills one of the members of the group, and I don't really know why she did that. This character wasn't in the original, so in killing her off a couple episodes in doesn't bring much of an impact to the story, and I quickly forgot about her in the next episode. I understand that weak links might pose a threat to her mission, but I just felt that killing someone off that early felt unnecessary and uneventful in how it was executed. Though it does beg the question if the only reason this Sam character was added to the script was just to be killed off in this moment, and honestly, what's the reason for having any of them around other than biding time before getting a hold of the manuscript? They're certainly not a very interesting group of people. I found myself disliking Ian a lot. He came off as a bit of a smug asshole, and not the good kind, and every time he'd smirk, this sour taste in my mouth just grew more powerful. He never felt like he blended well with the group, but to be fair, everyone in the group felt a bit uninteresting. Aside from Becky's Deals, there wasn't really much to her character. And look at how they massacred my boy, Wilson! They barely made any joke of his name. There's only ever a blink and you'll miss it remark.
Wilson?
Not a typo, just my name.
And he just feels like a louder and more bombastic character in this. And it honestly makes me shed a tear because I can remember so many wonderful Wilson moments that stick out in my brain as just being brilliant character moments. Moments translating conflicts that enrich his character. If you're at all interested in what I might be referring to, I urge you to watch Utopia for yourself. Oh god, it's beautiful. Honestly, if you want to talk about massacring my boys, look what they did to Arby. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. Arby is a fantastic character in Utopia. Not only can he be immensely threatening, what with his vacant stare, heavy breathing, and nearly expressionless visage, but he also has such an interesting character arc that appreciates him beyond being just a harrowing antagonist. I won't go into much detail in terms of spoilers, because even if you do watch to the end of this video uncaring of spoilers, I really do hope you heed my words and go and check out Utopia for yourself, because I really think it's worth your time. But I do want to go over one particular moment of the show that I feel perfectly demonstrates the beauty of his character and how this new version kind of screws that up. It's an intense scene where Arby kills some folks, and it is masterfully done to bring full weight to the action on screen. There is no music in the background. The way that it's choreographed as a one-shot take, it carries this scene impeccably, and the sound design of each bullet feels unnervingly real, with compliments to the actors who unfortunately had to take a couple of bullets, had to take some for the team. It is a haunting scene, but it is done with extensive care in how it was carried out in the show. And unfortunately for the 2020 version, some of the subject matter is a bit too hot to handle, if you catch my drift. So it's understandable that they changed some aspects for the remake. Although I would like to believe that they changed it up because they knew they couldn't recreate this incredible scene, it's most likely to avoid the controversial footsteps of its predecessor. Because why would you want to be controversial in a show about a freaking deep state organization that and killing dozens and dozens of people in the process? Sorry, I got a bit carried away there. Anyway, the remake's equivalent of this is bereft of any layered qualities that might make the scene somewhat as impactful as it was originally. It's strange to me that they would write this scene into the remake, but not bring over any of the controversial qualities or storied intricacies that made it so good to begin with. There's this great quote from that Rec Doug's video that perfectly explains how I feel about this scene and just wonderfully describes the show in general.
I just think these are important comparisons to make because it's not just that the scenes are kind of shit, it's that they needlessly change things about an existing blueprint in order to make it more shit. Like, it took more effort to make this a bad scene than it would have to make it a good scene. If you're going to make changes to an already great scene, would you not first take the time to understand why the scene was like that in the first place?
I mean, the purpose of this scene essentially mirrors that of the original, even including a fantastic character moment that they just absolutely butchered the hell out of by including this scream to cap it all off. Oh, congratulations, guys! You did it! You fixed Utopia! Yay! And I can't explain just how much of a sin it is that this remake of a mystery thriller is boring. Out of everything to take from the original and mess up in this new version, you had to make it boring? It is a mystery thriller that has barely any mystery to it, since you get up close and personal with the antagonists before watching our main group slowly figure out what we already know, and it's also not that thrilling. It's the opposite of it's boring. And that is a hugely devastating observation. Arby is not as nearly threatening as he is in the original, nor is he as interesting of a character. More so, he is a husk wearing the coat made of attributes from the former Arby's Wikipedia page to flaunt in the show. The characters are forgettable, the music is so-so, the theme song is kind of catchy, but aside from that, it's really just a generic score. The writing leaves much to be desired. The increased overall runtime and episode count is absolutely unjustified. The directing makes me yearn for the David Fincher version that will never see the light of day. It is unfortunately bland. But out of everything that bugs me about this show that I could pick apart and critique, there is one central flaw that has been plaguing me from the beginning, and it's why it's the title of this video. The inherent flaw with the US Utopia remake is that it is a remake of Utopia. Everything that is done in this show that mimics something of the original just feels inferior, not only by nature, but in how they chose to execute certain scenes and story elements. It is very difficult to talk about this show without comparing it to the original, because it's just not different enough to be identified as its own thing. It just feels like a muddled tracing of Utopia without any rhyme or reason for its existence, other than to be a remake. I apologize, my throat's getting a little bit sour, because I've been talking a bit too long now. When you have a show like Utopia that is so outstanding in its engaging writing and gorgeous cinematography, marvelous acting, and its utterly unique and vibrant musical score, it seems almost like an impossible task, or at least a sin, to even attempt to try and remake it. The only way I could possibly fathom that idea working is if somebody took the idea of Utopia and did something new and different enough to where it could be considered something that stands on its own rather than a milquetoast version of its predecessor. Obviously, it would be no Utopia, but I feel if the creator knew that but had such a unique take or perspective on how to execute their version on the story, they might be able to manifest something that could stand on its own and at least be considered good outside of the context of the original. And it breaks my heart thinking that we could have had something like that with David Fincher. But that never happened. And instead Amazon tried to save the idea, but that didn't really work as well. And it goes without saying, but I bear no ill will or disrespect to Gillian Flynn, who, after reading up on how she participated in the production before its release, I fully believe had just as much passion behind this project as Fincher did. But since Fincher didn't end up working as showrunner or director on that, it became Gillian's vision by force, pretty much. It was either that or not make it at all. So it's understandable that she hoped to still create the show even if the optimal showrunner couldn't attend. And it also made me speculate whether or not David Fincher would have taken the Amazon deal, even if he was free and available to work on it. Gillian said that Fincher wouldn't budge on the approximately $90 million budget for the show, and so taking into account Amazon's lesser offer of around $65 million, the question begs to be asked if David Fincher would have still wanted to do the show, but for less. And I'd like to think that the answer would be no. If that's the amount he needed in order to fully realize his vision, then that's the amount he was going to have to get in order for it to be completed. I would rather the project of his vision be done for his budget rather than someone else's less visionary version be made for less. You can even see bits of Fincher sprinkled throughout this thing, like the girl with the dragon tattoo vibes emanating from Jessica Hyde's character design. And as much as I believe Gillian Flynn is a pretty good writer, I haven't seen Gone Girl. I don't even know what that's about. I personally just don't think this project would have worked without Fincher at the helm. Instead, she picked up the pieces and did her absolute best to try and make the show something good, but all it ends up being is something inherently inferior to its inspiration. But then I took into account how much impact a director can have on the writing of a show when directing it for the screen. In my opinion, the show should have spent time creating side stories with new characters or generally exploring new things that we wanted to see in the original Utopia, but couldn't. Instead of focusing on reselling the same premise to a new audience, but with none of what made the original so special to begin with. I think it would have been cool for them to at least make it different enough so that returning Utopia fans could get that itch scratched when it comes to examining the world more. But unfortunately, that isn't what we got. Instead, the stories that it's trying to tell, the characters it wants to introduce us to, and the twisted world it invites us to explore have already been done much better before. It was a show called Utopia. Oh my god, I totally forgot. I have to thank my patrons. I forgot about that. Special thanks to my lovely patrons who choose to support me financially. Questionable choice, but thank you, Luke, Carlos, Dean, and Alex. I thank you immensely from the bottom of my heart. If you're at all interested in supporting me via Patreon, there will be a link right... No, you were early. It's right there. And in the description as well. But yeah, that about wraps it up. Please watch Utopia. Please watch Utopia. It is a fantastic drama that is incredibly well written. And check out the score as well. Check out the soundtrack. It's on YouTube. There's a bunch of bangers on there. Just go and check it out. Thank you, though, sincerely so much for watching. Don't forget to hug your loved ones. That's the video.